All right, welcome. This is the 11 a.m. session, what Zope did wrong and how it's being fixed. And I give you Lennart, I'm going to try this, Regebro. Close enough? Okay.
Close enough. Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Lennart Regebro, and the pronunciation of this is optional. It's fine. I'm an independent Python developer. I'm based in Paris, and I usually mostly do subcontracting for other companies, and most of it is Plone and a little bit Zope 3. I've been using Zopes since 99 and Python since Christmas 99 when I wrote my first Plone product. So first of all, this talk is not about how Zope sucks, because Zope does not suck. Zope is really, really great, and it does most things right. And it also did it much earlier than most other frameworks did it. It is one, I think, possibly the first web framework for Python. And some of the things it did right was, of course, it used Python. It used ZODB, or created ZODB, which is a fantastic database, object-oriented database. Even if you don't do web or don't do Zope or anything, if you use Python, you should take a look at ZODB. It's really, really cool. It had a security focus, always had. We had fine-grained access control. User management is built in because you really don't want to write your own user management, whatever Ruby on Rails people think. It has internationalization since a long time ago. It has Unicode everywhere, or it doesn't have it, but you can use Unicode everywhere since a long time ago. The templating languages are actually pretty good, and ZPT in particular has been very influential. And there's a plugin architecture for code reuse. It's called products in Zope 2, and in Zope 3 it's the component architecture. And it also introduced through the web development, which gave people a very easy way to get started in developing for the web. But what did it do wrong? This is what the talk is about. Well, it did through the web development. That's one of the first things. Through the web development, when you start with Zope, you typically start by creating templates and Python scripts and putting them in the ZODB, where they end up in a big pile. Quite quickly, this becomes ungainly and unmaintainable. And then what do? Well, you look in the documentation that tells you to use Z classes, which basically gives you an object-oriented way of dealing with this through the web development. But to do this, you have to rewrite most of the stuff you did. And Z classes still doesn't solve all of the problems with it through the web development because it's through the web. And even if you succeed in hacking a Zope server, which to my knowledge nobody has, but if you succeed, you should not be able to hack your way through this into the operating system. Therefore, through the web development is by always has to be restricted. And to get through these restrictions and get around them, because sooner or later you're going to end up with those restrictions, you need to do something called disk-based products. And because of these restrictions, everybody today basically does this. Very few people still using Z classes. They are more or less deprecated and are have, at least for several versions of Python, Zope, sorry, they've been broken more or less. But again, then you have to rewrite it. So this means that both the pile that you start with, a pile of scripts you start with, and Z classes are development dead ends. You run into a wall with them. This is a big problem of Zope 2. Zope also became a ghetto because it did things before everybody else did them, and it did them when other people then came around and did the same thing again, but slightly better. It was too much work to replace the way Zope did it with the other way the other people did it. So they didn't, which means that the Z server, which is the HTTP server in Zope, is still there in Zope too, the Z server. Even though WSGI has been around and Twisted has been around, and there's lots of other web servers that are probably slightly better, but it's too difficult to switch them out, switch the Z server out, so we keep the old one. And also, Zope has a tendency to attract people who hasn't used Python before, so it is a way into Python. But at the same time, people who has used Python before are not that attracted to Zope because it does things, or Zope 2, I should say, because it does things in slightly un-Pythonic ways. So it doesn't play well with other Python technologies, unless, you know, very pure Python, but other Python web technologies, I should say, it doesn't play very well with. And it's big monolith. You basically use all or nothing of Zope 2. These are big problems with Zope 2. There's also a lot of magic attributes and methods in Zope 2. Security is done by setting attributes on objects, on classes, I should say. And this is now done with a syntax that is very nice and almost like decorators, even if it's not actual decorators. So it's hidden, but it's still there in the background, and there's you can change how objects traverse with a special method called Bobo traverse and things like this. So there's special methods that, if you create them on the object, changes the behavior a bit. And what you could say, if you want to do it, you know, well and explain it well, is that Zope 2 does not have any sort of separation between things like model, controller, and view. There is no such separation. There's also backwards compatibility forever, even though there's a nice way of setting securities today, nicer way of doing it. The old ways are still working. And many parts of the internals, like the folder of the default folder of Zope, still uses the old way of doing it. Yeah, okay, so why did this now go black? Thank you. And it's badly documented. These three parts, or all these parts, means that you have a learning curve that looks like this for Zope 2. It starts off easy through the web developments. It's very easy to get started modifying and doing simple things. But it gets complicated the more you learn and the more things you do. And in the end, you end up at the high curve where you have to understand what all these magic attributes, all the magic functions do, and how they work and how they interact with each other. So then to fix this, well, no, the problems, so a summary of the problems. It's development dead ends, Zope is a ghetto, there's lots of magic and old craft, and there's no documentations. So, enter the knight in shining armor, which is Zope 3. And Zope 3 fixes this, more or less. You know, most of it's fixed. There is no more dead ends because there's no through the web development. There's no magic attributes and methods. Security is done by security proxies, which is much nicer and totally pluggable. The evolution is managed, so if there's a stupid idea in early versions of Zope 3 that has been replaced by something better, the early version does get deprecated and in many cases removed. It's not a ghetto, it's all very Pythonic, except that Python people generally doesn't like XML, which you have to do with in Zope 3. But otherwise it's very Pythonic. And the documentation is really fine. But there are some problems. The first one I call death by abstraction. Zope 3 builds on a component architecture, the Zope component architecture, which is really, really cool and very, very nice. But basically, everything is either an interface, a utility, or an adapter, or just a content object. And that's all everything is. It gets very abstract. When you create a view, you don't immediately have to know that the view is actually an adapter between an object and two specific interfaces. But quite soon, when you start doing more advanced stuff, you have to know that. And that's a problem. Also, this componentization of all of the Zope 3 means that everything is a very small, simple object do one thing and do it well. And this is how Zope 3 works. But this means that you tend to, during development, end up with several small Python files that work together, but it's not in the same file. And sometimes you even have different modules which need to work together. And the reason why something doesn't work can quite often be that your module interacts with another module in a specific way, and you have to figure out what that module is, and that's not always completely easy. If you're good at keeping track of lots of small things, and many programmers are, this is not a problem. But some programmers, especially people who are not, hardcore, really like frameworks and stuff, they're not so good at keeping track of 10, 20 things and having them all in the head at the same time. And they're going to find this a problem. And a friend of mine who's an educator and not a programmer really, but he does some programming, he dubbed this the conspiracy on the hard disk. Because there's lots of little things that seem to prevent you from actually getting some work done. That's what he thinks. I don't feel like this at all, and most Zope 3 programmers don't do this, but it's there, and it all adds up to simply that Zope 3 is very complicated. It's very complex to develop for Zope 3. That's the only real complaint I have. Stefan Richter, one of the Zope 3 developers, he said that I should be nicer to Zope 3 because people thought I was complaining about it, but I'm not. It's complicated. That's really all the problems there is. It has a learning curve that is better than Zope 2. It's very high in the beginning. There's lots of stuff you need to know. It's very complicated, but it gets better. At the end, when you have understood all the basic principles and concepts, all you need to know is to learn the libraries that are there, all the modules that are there. I heard that it's a problem then if, for example, a Ruby on Rails programmer comes and starts working with Zope 3, that they re-implement the security because they don't know that there is security modules there. So it's better. But of course, Zope 3 is a complete rewrite. We know this is the worst mistake you can do. And I don't know if it was the worst mistake, but it could have been done better. So the end result is because you can't use your Zope 2 products in Zope 3, but you still want to use the component architecture and all the cool things that are in Zope 3, we used them in Zope 2 as well through a technology called 5. So then you get this learning curve, and you get this learning curve at the same time. This is not a problem for Zope 2 in itself if you're just starting to use Zope 2, because you don't have to use the Zope 3 technologies, right? But if you use something that does, for example, Plone, if somebody who knows Python today gets the job of developing a Plone application and doing advanced stuff in Plone, this is what they're going to encounter. And people that this happens to aren't happy. So the question is, can this be fixed? Can we somehow have the low entry threshold that we got through the web development and the power of Zope 3 or big frameworks and component architecture without having any dead ends as we had in Zope 2? Well, yeah, we can. We need a learning curve that looks like this. You have a first low entry where you learn some specific thing that's not too complicated, where you can do a specific set of features, a specific set of functionality you can create and use it for. And then when you want to do something else, you then have another defined set of features that you want to learn, and then you need to learn. And then after you learn that, you can do a lot of other stuff. And you get this. So every time you run into a wall, there should be a specific set, a well-documented thing that you need to learn to get past this. And you do this by layering. And these are not the layers that you have to have. You don't have to, call the layers like this. You don't have to have exactly 4 layers. This is not important. It's just an example, a graphical illustration of what you need. So if we take an example, if you have an information manager, somebody who knows what information goes where on the website, what kind of fields a specific content type needs, this guy usually don't know Python. If you have written a system purely in Zope 3, and he wants to add a field to a content type, maybe you now need to say that you should have environmental ratings, European environmental ratings on your fridges for your website. He knows that it should go there, but if you have written it in pure Zope 3, to stick it in there, he has to actually modify the schema, which is a type of interface in Zope 3, with Python code. He doesn't know Python. So should he learn Python? Well, no, he probably hires somebody to do it, which is kind of silly, because if he had been able to do it himself, he could do it in 5 minutes. But now he has to hire somebody that needs to know how their system works, and it's going to take them 2 days. It's very inefficient to do it this way. So what he instead wanted, or should have, is some sort of schema-driven content types, is what at least it's been called in the Plone community, that you easily define up the schema of the content type and that he can change it. And another thing that you then end up might wanting to do is to add a portlet, for example. Now, if you can, of course, just add a portlet through the web, or create a new portlet, I should say, by just configuring. It's going to be a bit tricky, because you're going to at least need to know HTML. But if you know HTML, why shouldn't you be able to create a portlet with just HTML? So that would then be another layer, another sort of system that you can use. And it's well defined what you do, what you use it for. You use it for the graphical presentation. Next step would be adding blogging. You want to blog about fridges. So then you have to write a blogging application. Well, then now you, of course, need to know Python. Now you need to know how to develop stuff. But this is still yet another layer in the whole application stack. And in the end, you want to change how the framework works. Well, then you have to understand all the complexities of the framework. But with this layered stack, you can get this fluffy cloud learning curve, where it's one defined step that you need to learn. So is Zope trying to fix this? Yes, the Zope community is fixing this. We're getting towards a fluffy cloud learning curve. And how? Well, first of all, Zope 3 has been eggified. It's no longer, well, you can still download a TGZ and install it, but it's now preferred that you run a build out, which will download all the eggs that make up Zope 3. You can also easy install eggs directly by themselves. Most of the eggs in Zope 3, most of the modules depend on each other, so if you install one of them, you'll get all of Zope 3. But many of the basic ones, like, for example, Zope.component, works with just the, I think, 4 or 5 eggs needed for the component architecture. You can easily install Zope.component, and you can start using component architecture and writing a component-based plugin system for your application immediately, right now, and there's no XML involved, I promise. Another thing that's happening is called repos. Repos is written by Agendaless Consulting, and it's an effort to split up the publisher of Zope 2 into WSGI middlewares. So, for example, you get a WSGI middleware transaction manager, you get an exception handler and logger, all done in WSGI middleware. So other people can use this. Any other WSGI framework would be able to use these kind of things. And connected into this, also done by Agendaless, is something called Deliverance, which is a WSGI middleware for skinning and designing and doing this kind of stuff with your website. You basically take an HTML that looks like you want your website to look, and you have a rules file where you say this piece of output from the WSGI application comes to this place in the HTML file that you wanted. So you can skin anything like this. It's very nice and cool. You can easily get then the same look with completely different frameworks, so you can integrate Track and Plone and make them look the same. Another thing that's been going on is Grok, which is a web application framework for Zope 3 that makes development for Zope 3 look a little bit like Django and Turbo Gears. It's the same type of application development. You have models and you have views, and you don't have to care about the XML anymore. The connection of different components, which is what the XML does in Zope 3, is being done automatically by code inspection in Grok instead. Grok enables somebody who knows Python to get started and write applications really fast with Zope 3 and still have all the power of the Zope 3 framework and all the features of Zope 3 readily available. And these things are trying to build these layers from the bottom up. They're trying to make the bottom layered so you can take out parts, put in other parts in this layered cake of application hierarchy. Dexterity goes from the other way. Dexterity is very much a work in progress, or maybe it hasn't even been started yet, I'm not sure. But it's an example of what's happening. It's a schema-driven product for Plone, so that you can do schema-driven content types. That is, you can make content types for Plone without knowing anything about Python. So this is a good product for all the manager type out there. So with these products, we're hoping that Zope 2 and Zope 3 and the whole Zope community is going to be this nice fluffy cloud in the future. It's going to be easy for Python developers to get in and start applications, write applications for Zope. And of course, as Python developers, you're going to get in somewhere in the middle of the cloud. It's going to be easy also for manager type guys, people who don't know Python, to get started and use Plone and Zope and Python. That's the idea. Thank you. So, questions? Yeah, it's a good question. The question was, how do I see Zope 2 evolving into this, or if it's just going to go away? Well, repos is aimed at doing this for both Zope 2 and Zope 3, and I think they've mostly been working on Zope 2 at the moment. So it's going to definitely go into this. Also, dexterity then is for Plone, which is for Zope 2. So that's going to happen. And there are talk about, we're already, some parts of Zope 2 has been replaced by the equivalent Zope 3 technologies. The page templates today, for example, in I think it was in 2.10, was replaced by the Zope 3 page template engine. And there's efforts of doing this for the rest of the stuff. And of course, repos is going to get rid of the publisher in Zope 2, which is one of the really big, difficult things to get rid of. So yeah, I think it's going to be, I mean, the long-term goal, we're hoping that basically Zope 2 is going to evolve into a set of eggs as well that you can install in Zope 3. And so you basically run Zope 3, but use the Zope 2 eggs as backwards compatibility. That's the hope, but that's years away. Next question. Yeah? Because I don't know exactly what the state is. Grok depends on Zope 3, and Zope 3 doesn't officially support 2.5 yet, but I think it kind of works, from what I understand. I'm not 100% sure what the status is, but the idea is anyway that it's gonna support 2.5 and of course 2.6. Yes. More questions? Come on. We got a couple of minutes left. Yeah. Okay, the question is what CODB can solve that object relational mappers and relational databases can't. Well, I mean, it is, from my point of view, if you want to have objects and you want to have object persistently, why don't you use an object-oriented database instead of having the trouble of an ORM in between? That's basically my point of view. It's just so much easier. ZODB is written in Python. It's Python only. It uses all the nice... The reason I discovered when it comes to... I really liked object-oriented databases, I thought, because I used ZODB. Turns out, no, that's not object-oriented databases. That was Python. That was cool. Because it's schemaless. You just create an object, and it's just there, and you set attributes on it, and it just gets persisted. The whole point of ZODB is that you don't have to think about it. It's just there. I saw somebody else wave. No? Yeah. What are the downsides to ZODB? I'm not exactly sure. It seems to be a bit slow when it comes to writing, and people are trying to really look into why, and the tests that have been done and the comparisons turns out that it's not, so we don't really know. It was just a week or two ago somebody did a write comparison with Postgres, and it's actually slightly faster. So, yeah, Christian? Yeah. Yeah. So if you didn't hear that, go to Christian and ask him to repeat it because it was long. But yeah, that's a very good point there, is that it's basically Python only. That's a big drawback. More questions? No? Well, that's it then.